Thank you so much, Selena. I love that she mentioned kind of the accessibility of art, the artworks, as well as the art world, and to kind of really connect the dots, or to really kind of make a link to what Selena was sharing. I'm delighted to introduce our next guest speaker, who has traveled all the way from London to join us, Ms. Bernadine Vida, CEO and co-founder of Vastari, who will be speaking on shaping collections, connecting the dots in the art world. Welcome, Bernadine.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for having me. It's a delight to be in Hong Kong today. And as mentioned, my name is Bernadine Wieder. I'm the CEO of a company in London called Vastari. And if you happen to have watched the first video of the first Art and Tech Summit in London, we were actually the partner that helped produce the Art and Tech Summit on blockchain in July 2018. But at the time, we didn't really talk about what we were doing at Vastari. We were more passionate about raising awareness about art and technology, the potential for blockchain, and we felt that there was a lot of misinformation out there about how technology was impacting the art world. And it's amazing to see how it's continued to grow over these past years into something that is a real conversation on a global stage, including here in Asia. So for the first time, instead of just propagating art and technology, I'm going to be talking about our work at Vastari in London and sharing a little bit about the way that we work with data and how we are trying to connect the dots in the art world. So our team in London has a slogan that we use sometimes that is, "Connections matter." And when you first hear that slogan, you sometimes think of an address book. You think of who you know is your way in. And that's the way that the art world really works today. It's very much about knowing the right people and at the right time. But we actually think of connections in a different way. We're named after an art historian from the 16th century called Giorgio Vasari. He wrote a book that was, how many of you know The Lives of the Artists by Vasari? Just a quick raise of hands. Yes, a few, exactly. So he wrote a book about the artists at the time that has helped people understand those artists in a different way than the traditional. So what was revolutionary about the book that Vasari wrote at the time is that, number one, he wrote it in Italian. So he didn't, Latin was the language of the people at the time, rather than was the language of the elite, and Italian was the language that people were speaking normally. He decided to write it in the language of the normal people. He also told the stories in a very timeless and accessible way, and he had quite an entertaining tone. Some people would even call it gossip. But it really connects with people, and that still, 500 years later, resonates with us today. So I would argue that the reason these works are getting headlines, including the Salvator Mundi, of course, here at Christie's, we're going to be thinking about that, but also last month when at Frieze London, there was a Botticelli that had its own stand at Frieze London, Frieze Masters, or a Raphael drawing that sold for almost $50 million. These artists were described by Vasari at the time, and there are little connections that make you love them. So Leonardo would follow a person when he really liked their beard or their hair and try and get to know it really well and go home and paint it. Or Botticelli was seen as just this really perfectly a great craftsman of portraiture and of being able to capture the light. Then Raphael, this is where it gets a bit gossipy, supposedly passed away in the throes of passion with the daughter of a baker. So people will remember that. Those are connections that matter. They are the way that we feel something about this art beyond just the visual, and it makes us remember these stories. And what we think at Vastari is that today's vernacular is the exhibition history. So all of these ways in which audiences engage with the content helps people feel connected with the content. And it's in kind of juxtaposition to a different type of connections that is provenance, that's currently very much the center of the art market. When you're looking at the sales that are happening, for example, when I was researching the Raphael drawing that sold for almost $50 million, it was owned by an heir to a British family And he was on the board of directors of Sotheby's at the time. So it's very much about who you know, but the original person would have bought that piece because it was famous, because of those connections from Vasari. So it's kind of an interesting thing how the art market has continued to be thinking about provenance and ownership rather than exhibition history. And when you buy a work of art, you always get these different pieces of information about it. So you'll find out what the object is, who made it. Then you also receive information about the provenance, so who owned it, where has it been sold before, etc. You also get information about the exhibition history. And then those things all come together to give you the perceived value of that work. But, for example, this is a piece by an artist from the 30s. You can get them for a very affordable price, despite being in very famous collections, because the artist doesn't have as much exhibition history. So it kind of has made me think a lot over the last time that I've been working on this company about how do we make new connections? Because all of that perceived value currently is very much reserved in a certain circle of connections. The people that know each other, the museums that know each other, the collectors that know each other, and can we find a way to make new connections that matter? And so it all started 8 years ago, almost to the day, that I was managing a gallery in Mayfair that sells Impressionist and modern art. And one of our collectors came up to me and said, I had the perfect drawing for that exhibition at that museum, but the curators didn't contact me. How can I make sure that next time the curators can contact me about their show and borrow my piece? And I started investigating how could I help this collector to be able to make their works available next time? And there wasn't really an answer. It was kind of, well, let the people who are in the know, and then they'll connect with you once they need that work. And that seems a little bit unhelpful because you always have a middleman, you always have a vested interest on which piece gets chosen, and ultimately these exhibitions are what are creating the value for our people in 500 years' time. So that's all happening due to coincidence. It seemed a little bit wrong. So I wrote a business plan and I decided to set up a company. And I named it Vastari because it was inspired by Vasari, but with a little T for technology in there, so that you could have the connections and use technology to be able to do what Vasari did in a new way. And it's more vast. His book was Lives of the Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And the truth is, exhibitions today include so many more media than just painting, sculpture, and architecture. And I went out naively with two assumptions. I assumed that content owners, collectors, wanted to share their pieces to get more connections for that exhibition history that creates value, to learn more about the works, and to support the artists. My second assumption was that museums would want to show in order to be able to find potential patrons, maybe to increase their ticket sales, maybe to add to the story of their exhibition in a way that they didn't expect. I'm saying assumptions because actually, when I went out there and tried to get more and more of them to show their works, I actually launched a database in 2013 that looked like this. This is not how it looks like today, but it was the original version that was helping collectors make their works available anonymously, and that only museum curators could contact them to be able to borrow the works. And I was really optimistic. I thought everyone is going to use this. But the truth is, sometimes content owners want to share, and sometimes museums want to show it. And there was very little information about why. I was in the dark. There was no information about why this museum wants to borrow this Leonardo, but this one doesn't. Why does this museum want to work with this contemporary artist, and this one doesn't? It was a really, really complex ecosystem. And what we actually found is that there are content owners. They could either own an individual object, or they could own the intellectual property of a whole exhibition. And then you have the venues that host those exhibitions. They can be a museum, but they can also be a private museum, they can be a commercial gallery, they can be a shopping mall. And then you have all of the suppliers that are supplying these exhibitions, and there are lots of risks. So there are all these different factors that are causing the coincidence of the exhibition history that creates value. And we set out to figure out how we could get better data about this. So the initial thing you think of is big data, right? Like scraping, we're going to use AI, we're going to be doing all of this stuff. But the truth is, that didn't work. We started out that way, and the information wasn't reliable. You couldn't really know if the National Gallery had created that exhibition themselves, if they had created it in partnership, or if they had even paid to host that exhibition. It was nowhere. And if you look at the object exhibition history, you don't know if that was a touring exhibition or an exhibition that was only in one location. You don't know who the collector was that lent that piece at that time. All of that is in the dark. So we stopped the build it and they'll come strategy, which we had in the initial, and we started working on real hard facts. So we verified every single museum that joined our platform. We made sure that they were coming from honest and reliable sources, and we started from scratch. And also, in the typical startup style, you want users, users, users. We stopped looking for as many users as possible, and we wanted active users. We wanted people that we knew were really going to be involved in exhibitions, and we incentivized them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we took that data-driven approach to connect the dots. So the first bit of data that we needed was more honest information about the supply that is out there. So in terms of the objects, we started asking collectors more questions about their pieces. It was still anonymous, so you still wouldn't know who the owner was, but the curator that was searching could understand a bit more about that piece itself. And then we started looking at the exhibitions as a whole that were available to tour. And we would ask the exhibition producer to explain what the costs were of that exhibition. We saw too many times that exhibition concepts were very attractive to a museum, but actually once you started talking about money, there was a disconnect of how they could work together. So we made it mandatory. Then we also started looking at the other side. What do museums want? But we didn't just ask them, do you want a show about Picasso? We asked them, why do you choose an exhibition? So the majority of them look at, of course, the compatibility with an exhibition's focus. Sorry, it's a bit faded, but if you log into our platform, you can read the entire report. So the number one on the turquoise piece is compatibility with an exhibition's thematic focus. Number two is cost. And way down at the bottom, at 4.26%, is profitability. So museums, when they're choosing their shows, they're actually thinking more about the cost than about the potential profit. To anyone who is commercially minded, that seems antithetical. If you could potentially make a lot of money from that exhibition, why wouldn't you host it? But they're more worried about whether they can afford it in the first place than about whether it could make money. And then we also compared art and science institutions to be able to understand how science institutions are hosting exhibitions and art institutions. And it really brought a lot of interesting things. But also, because we started surveying all of these museums, we could actually get information about the market size. So we now know that the weighted average number of exhibitions that museums host a year is 7, and that even though there's a huge difference in size between micro institutions, which are less than 4,000 square feet, and very large institutions that are more than 40,000 square feet, so 10 times difference, there's only 2.5 times difference in the number of exhibitions they do. So the larger institutions just create larger exhibitions, not more of them. But we had the data to prove that. We also started understanding what the size of the market was financially, which was really interesting because that's never been done before. So we could see that $5.9 billion a year is spent on hiring fees at ICOM accredited institutions, and that the value of works is approximately $180 billion. So that means it's 3 times the size of the art market according to the Art Basel report. This is a very significant industry, and we were completely in the dark about it. So really what we shifted was to think about how we could verify all of the data we handled and stop thinking about big data, but think about small, reliable data. And we basically, the other thing, for example, exhibition history on an object tends to be a text paragraph. But you really want to know, what are the museums in that text? What are the titles of the exhibitions in that text? What are the dates, rather than just a paragraph? Because then you can start doing more machine understanding of it. So we changed that. And as I mentioned, we made mandatory fields, and then we incentivize people. So the reason that museums tell us about their finances and about the way that they work is we give them reports for free as a result of contributing to the data. So if you wanted to subscribe to the reports, you'd have to pay an annual subscription fee, but as a museum that takes part in the reports, you get access for free. And that way, people felt that they were sharing their knowledge and they were taking part in something shared. Of course, we're not going to say, this museum has this budget. We'll never publish that publicly. We're just aggregating the information in order to identify trends and know what's happening. It is a slow process. So if we look back, basically, we have 9,400 institutions that are somehow registered on Vastari. Those are those registered users we were really trying to get, right? But only 625 have completely completed their profile in the last 2 years. It's taking a really long time to convince them to take part. But, and then on the collector side also, we have 325, a bit more of the proportion-wise, but still small data. But even with that small data, we facilitated over $1.4 billion worth of matches in terms of touring content last year. And this year, we already topped that in the last six months, in the January to June. So I'm really realistic about our small data. We only made 15 matches in 2016. We're very honest about the fact that it's been growing slowly and gradually. But I think there's real value in being honest about what you can do. And we are going to make almost 1,000 matches this year for exhibitions around the world. And in last month, we facilitated exhibitions going to museums all around the world, from USA to Australia to Brazil. So it's really something global that we've achieved with small data. And the last stat that I'm quite proud of is that for every 20 museums that we approach with a potential collaboration, at least one of them is interested in a contract. So our data has gotten so good that we can now target people and be able to talk to them about what they really care about, rather than just spamming them with a lot of ideas of what they should host. And the last thing that I'm really excited about is, once you have this reliable data, we can go back to that art and tech story. The reason that I spoke to Christie's about blockchain back in 2018, and the reason why I've been talking more about championing art and tech than about necessarily what Vastari is doing behind the scenes. Because if we can start having good data about this, we can start having new content. So then we can start understanding how to bring in these virtual reality exhibitions, how to bring in exhibitions from new geographies, because it's not a big mystery. It's not like, how in the world does this exhibition system work? You can actually get in there. And we can innovate the way that collaborations are negotiated. Imagine if we can have ticketing revenue share logged in the blockchain so that the artists can get something back for their works at some point. That could be possible one day, but we need to get good data first. And lastly, of course, you can bring in new players. I think that just having exhibitions at museums is not the future. The future is having exhibitions everywhere. And the more we can be transparent about the way in which these exhibitions work, the more new players can get involved and the more exhibitions we can have all around us. So this is one of the exhibitions we have on our platform. It's by Marshmallow Laser Feast. It was at the Saatchi Gallery in London, and it was extended 3 times because it was so popular. This is the type of art that really inspires me, because it's making connections with people in a way that hasn't been done before, at the forefront of technology and art. And what we want to do really is champion this vernacular, these timeless, accessible stories, things that touch every single person around, but still make it entertaining, so that then all the content that we have at museums still inspires people for 500 more years to come. Thank you very much.